Hi, welcome to this tutorial. Today I'm going to take you through the Neve Genesys console in our setup at SAE Cape Town. This console has 16 inputs. Across the top we have our microphone preamps. Every channel has a built-in dynamics, EQ and a pair of insert points. We have 6 auxiliaries to choose from. We have the direct output, a monitor section for bringing signals back into the console for inline style monitoring, and of course our motorized faders down the bottom. On the right hand side here we have some 8-track faders, which are essentially our subgroups, and we can route those to auxiliaries. We have auxiliary masters in this light blue section over here. We have 4 reverb returns for bringing reverb back into the mix. And we have our master section down the right hand side over here with our control room section, our 2 cues and various different control and routing settings. This console also acts as a DAW controller, which means I can switch into Pro Tools and control Pro Tools directly from the faders over here. At the top of the channel strip we have the channel input section, which consists of 4 different inputs. They're selectable by pressing the trim knob, so I can select between mic, line, DAW, or a digital line. Most of the time we'll use our microphone input or our DAW return from Pro Tools. At the top we have our preamp gain, which only applies to the microphone, which goes up in 5 dB steps and is indicated on the top of the knob. We have a phantom power switch, which takes some time to charge up. We have a pad switch for high input signals, a high Z switch for high impedance sources, a phase reverse switch, and a high pass filter set at 90 Hz. We also have the channel panner, which needs to be engaged to be used to pan between left and right. Below that we have the processing section, where we can engage the dynamics section of the channel strip, the EQ, or 2 different insert points. In this studio we only have insert 1 connected up to the patch bay. The aux section has 6 auxiliaries, aux 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's a 6th one that's selectable by pressing on the panner knob. The first 4 are all mono, and auxes 5 and 6 are stereo with the pan control up here. You engage the aux send simply by clicking on it, as I'm doing at the moment. Right now these are configured as pre-fader sends from the channel strip. There's also the option to use the auxiliary sends as routing into the 8-track buses, which allows us some more complex routing options. The monitor section over here allows us to bring a second input into the channel, which allows us to mix more than 16 channels on the console. This has various different inputs, including the DAW return, a DAW send, a channel signal pre or post fader, or various different secondary inputs. This also includes a pan knob that needs to be engaged. Below that are various switches for selecting the channel, swapping the monitor and channel paths around, or performing solo and cut functions on the monitor section. And of course we have our output faders, which are the volumes of each of these channels, with solo and cut functions on each of them. And remember, we're sending signal to Pro Tools pre-fader, so it doesn't matter where the level of these faders are, it won't affect your recorded signal. The master section consists of our control room section, 2 cue mixers, our auxiliary masters, 4 reverb returns, and various different routing and setting switches. We also have some rotary encoders, which are used to control the built-in EQ or dynamics sections, or the DAW control. On the right hand side we have our talkback section, which allows us to talk back to all of the cues. The control room section allows us to listen to various different buses within our console, including the auxiliaries, the cues, the 8 tracks, or the main mix. These are all internal paths. We could also choose to listen to one of the external inputs, which are available in the patch bay, or as a digital stereo return from Pro Tools. The main control room level is set with a big red encoder, and the default level here is -15. Of course we can also use the cut function to mute the speakers, dim or mono our mix to hear what it sounds like in mono. Let me take you through how we use the console in our setup. The first thing we need to do is recall the default settings of the console. At the top over here we go to Filing, and then on the screen we use the little trackpad to navigate on this little tiny control screen, and we're looking for the most recent SAE Neve preset. You select it, you press load, and you press OK. The console will reset all the soft switches and faders, and then it'll walk you through a recalling session where it tells you where to set all the different knobs. And I'll go through channel by channel, following the instructions on the screen, and reset the controls that it tells me to reset. It checks through another 2 times just to make sure that nothing else has moved. When you're done, you can exit. I've got a condenser microphone plugged into channel 2. I need to make sure that phantom power is enabled. We also need to be listening to the microphone signal. Then we set the input gain using the big gain knob. And I want to get this so that it averages around the plus 4 dB mark, or 0 VU, which is about the middle of the meter. 1, 2, 1, 2. We can also use the trim control to fine-tune that signal to make sure we're not peaking at all. Then all we need to do is turn up the main fader to hear it, and make sure that our main mix fader is up, and that our monitor levels are also up. And we should be able to hear that input signal coming through the main mix. Getting that signal into Pro Tools is quite easy. All we need to do is create a mono audio track and select one of the inputs. Right now it's coming in from line input number 2 because we're on channel 2. The outputs right now are defaulted to outputs 15 and 16, which are our playback channels. We can then hit record and we should see some input signal coming in from that channel. Those returns are coming back on channels 15 and 16, which are set to DAW mode and panned hard left and right. That gives us a stereo playback from Pro Tools, which usually carries the entire mix coming out of Pro Tools. This is a nice way to blend between the playback signal from Pro Tools and the direct signal from our microphone channels. Here we need to make a choice between what signal we're hearing, because right now our channel is in record mode, which means we're hearing that signal looping through Pro Tools and coming back into our playback channels. And we're also hearing the direct signal straight from the microphone. So we need to choose. Do we want to hear, if I cut that signal, I'll only hear the signal looping through Pro Tools. Instead, I could always just mute the channel in Pro Tools and then we won't hear that signal looping back, which means we're hearing the signal coming directly from the microphone without any latency. This is ideal for recording. The rest of the mix is coming back on channels 15 and 16, which allows us to control that playback level of everything else. Sometimes in a recording session, it's useful to break out individual channels onto channel strips on the console, which allows us to have hands-on control over things like a click track or perhaps individual channel playback levels. So if we add a click track to the session, track, create click track, I can take this output over here and instead of routing it to our default 15 and 16, I'll route it to output 14, which means it's going to come into the top of channel strip number 14. I just need to make sure that that's set to DAW mode so it hears that signal coming back. That's going to carry our click signal now. Which means we can control how much of that click goes to various different auxiliaries for things like headphone mixes. You could take it a step further and break out individual stems onto pairs of channels on the console so that you have more flexibility during a recording session. Then when we're recording vocals, we can actually balance between these different elements on the console. To create a Q mix for the artist next door, we're going to use Q mix number 2, which feeds our headphone amplifier. We need to make sure that it's on, and then we can choose from various different input sources. Most of the time, it's easiest just to give everybody the entire mix by turning on this utility knob and just cranking it all the way up. That way, the artist hears the entire mix of whatever's coming through your main mix bus. Everyone hears the same thing, and it's much easier to run a recording session like that. In some cases, it's useful to give certain people a specific mix. So we have 6 auxiliary outputs and 6 headphone outputs next door. Aux 1 through to 6 feeds headphone amplifier channels 1 to 6, which feeds the outputs 1 to 6 next door. Let's say, for example, we had a drummer with his headphones plugged into output number 3. We're going to use aux 3. So first, let's make sure the auxiliary master is on for aux 3. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So aux 3's master is on, and then we can create a mix on any channel. We can send it into aux 3, and the drummer will hear more of that channel. Let's say he wants to hear more click track, for example, on channel 14 here. We can go up to aux 3, turn it on, and just turn that up. And he's going to hear more of that click track than anybody else. In fact, I could turn the fader all the way down. Nobody hears click track except the drummer because he's the only one that we're sending that signal to. What happens if we had a bass guitarist who wants to hear something else as well? Let's pretend his headphones are plugged into aux number 2. So we turn on aux 2, turn it up, and then we can create a mix of any channels going into aux number 2, which is this row. So he wants to hear maybe some of the drums playback, he maybe wants to hear some of the bass guitar, he wants to hear some of the guitars, a little bit of the click maybe, and anything else that we wanted to send, including perhaps the live inputs. If you want to talk back to the artist through their headphones, you can use the talkback section over here. You simply hold down the talkback level and talk through the built-in microphone on the console. You can also control the talkback signal using these knobs over here. Each channel has a built-in EQ and dynamics section, which are accessed from the encoders over here at the bottom, and we control those using the screen. Remember, these are analog EQs built into the console. We're just controlling them from a digital platform. To use the EQ, first enable the EQ on the channel strip section. Then we go to the EQ section under the encoders here and select our channel using the arrows. We're on channel 2. We adjust the EQ by turning the encoders over here, and you'll see the encoders responding on the screen. To set the frequency of each band, you press in the encoder and twist it. The low shelf band goes from 35 Hz up to 220 Hz. The mid band is from 350 Hz up to 7.2 kHz, and the high shelf goes from 16 kHz down to 10 kHz. These are very broad band equalizers, but the mid band can be set to a high Q if we wanted to do some more fine tuning. And these EQs are great for recording through or for mixing. To adjust the dynamics section, we need to make sure that dynamics is enabled on the channel. Then we go to the dynamics section and again use these encoders to set the ratio, threshold or release time. To set a fast attack, we just click in the third encoder to engage fast attack mode. If you want to access the built-in gate, just click the first encoder and it'll switch across to gate mode. The gate and compressor are both active at the same time. We'll also notice the gain reduction meters for the dynamics section on the side. To patch in an outboard compressor on the channel, we first need to make sure that the channel insert is engaged. Then we take a patch cable and patch from the channel insert send into one of the compressor's inputs. We take the output of the compressor and return it into the channel insert return. We can also add external compression to our entire mix, like these Neve bus compressors. We take the mix insert sends and patch it into inputs of those compressors, left and right. And then we take the returns, left and right, from the output of the compressor and go back into the return of the mix. And then we engage the mix insert button at the top of the master section, and we can make it pre-fader if we want. We set up the compressor to work, then when we listen to our mix through this, we should be able to hear some compression. Let's add some effects to our vocals using an outboard reverb unit. We're going to use aux number 1, so I take my microphone channel, send it to aux 1 and turn up the send level. We also need to make sure that the master level is up, so aux 1 master should also be on and turned all the way up. Then we're going to patch in on the patch bay from aux send number 1 into one of the inputs on the lexicon unit. The outputs of the lexicon unit will go into one of the 4 stereo reverb returns up at the top right-hand side of the patch bay. To hear the reverb coming back into the mix, we need to turn up the reverb return knob, make sure that it's on, and then we need to also make sure that the 8 tracks are turned up so that we can hear that reverb returning back into our mix. Routing into the 8-track subgroups is done by using the RTE select button at the top, or route select, and then we can use this routing matrix on the screen to route signal out of the main mix and into the 8-track returns. And then we can use these as perhaps subgroups for drums or for adding bus processing using the 8-track inserts. By default, the reverb returns are routed into the 4 pairs of 8-track subgroups. And if you want to use them as stereo, you should engage the stereo panners up at the top and pan them hard left and right. The console has a special configuration mode called Master Select Mode, which is outlined in the manual in big blue sections. This allows us to configure various different functions on the console, but most importantly, it lets us set our auxiliaries to pre or post fader. We access this by holding the lock button and pressing RTE Select, and it goes into the special setup mode. Then if we look at our auxiliaries, we can click them in to swap them over between pre-fader on the channel or monitor, pre-fader on the monitor, post-fader on the channel, or pre-fader on the channel. So we can cycle through those various different options. When you're recording, you want your auxiliaries to be pre-fader so that we can use them as Q-sends. When you're mixing, you usually want it to be post-fader so that we can use it as a post-fader auxiliary send. When you're done, you can just hit the RTE select button again. So now I'm going to try and do some mixing using the console. I'm going to break several channels out of Pro Tools onto the channel strips themselves, and we'll do some mixing and processing right here. In Pro Tools, I need to jump to the mix window, and my drum kit I've routed out into various different line outputs from channels 1 through to 6. I've had to sum some channels together. The guitars are going from channel 7 through to channel 11. The bass is all on channel 12. These synthesizer instruments are all coming into 13 and 14 as a stereo bus, and all my vocals are coming into 15 and 16 as a stereo bus. So now we're going to bring these onto the console. If I hit play in Pro Tools, on the console I need to bring these into the DAW inputs. So channel by channel, I switch them into DAW mode. Or we can use the global DAW button on the right hand side, which puts them all into DAW mode. As we bring them up in the mix, we should be able to hear those different channels. So my drums are on the first 6 channels, my guitars are channel 7 to 11, 12 is bass guitar, and I've got some stereo synths and some vocals on these last 2 channels over here. The ones that are stereo I'm going to pan hard left and right, so the vocals are already enabled and they're panned hard left and right as a stereo bus. The synths also need to be panned left and right, and I think my drum overheads are on channels 5 and 6, so I'm going to pan those to the left and right as well. Everything else is going to start off as a mono channel. Let's add a little bit of reverb to these. So the vocals, I'm going to send it to the reverb. I have the reverb set up on aux 1, so I'm going to turn up aux 1, make sure it's on, and I'm going to make sure that the return is set up by turning up the return level, turning it on, and bringing up the pair of 8 tracks. Then if I go to my vocal channels and send them to aux 1, I get a little bit of reverb. I'm going to add that same reverb to some of the guitars and to the snare. Right now my reverb sends are all in pre-fader mode. Ideally I'd want them to be in post-fader, and I've shown you how to do that already. I'm not going to do it right now. I've still got my bus compressor patched in, so I'm going to add that in by enabling the insert on the channel, and I'm going to make it pre-fader. So I should be playing through my bus compressor right now. Let's do some basic processing on this. I'm going to use my snare drum as an example because it's an easy way to demonstrate what's going on. So if I solo that, let's do a little bit of EQ on this first. So I enable the EQ button on the channel. Then on the screen, I can go to the EQ section. And let's brighten it up a little bit. So I'm going to use the high shelf at about 12K. Maybe it's a little too much. I'm also going to add a little bit more crispiness in the middle, so that's about 1.6K. And a little bit more body, 110 Hertz. Now you'll notice that I'm boosting at all 3 different frequencies over here. Usually I don't advocate for boosting everything, but this EQ happens to sound particularly good when you do stuff like this. It's a very broad, gentle EQ, and it happens to sound particularly musical. I can also go through the dynamic section. Let's add a little bit of compression to this. So I go to the compressor. I'm going to choose a ratio of about maybe 4:1 as a starting point. Drop my ratio, drop my threshold, and I need to make sure that the dynamics is engaged on the channel. As I drop the threshold, I'm getting a little bit more compression. If I engage fast attack mode, you'll notice that the transient disappears completely. And the compressor becomes very aggressive. I think I'm happy with that. We can link channels together as a stereo pair as well. So if I take something like my vocals, I'm going to solo those 2, go to the EQ section and enable the EQs on those 2. Then in the EQ, I'm going to scroll across to channels 15 and 16, and I want to link these controls together. To do this, we use the little buttons at the bottom here, F1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is available just below those encoders. F1 is bypass, and then I can copy and paste with F2 and F3, and I can set up links and view those links using F4. So if I press F4, I can set up the links now, and I can select, using the yellow button, channel 15 is linked to channel 16. Press F4 again, and those 2 are now linked together. If I make a change on channel 15, let's just add a massive boost to the bottom end. Scroll across to channel 16, and that same boost is present there. So those controllers are linked together, which means I can EQ these 2 as a stereo pair now. Let's listen to these vocals and see what we can do with them. take down a little bit of the low end at 220 Hertz just to thin it out a little. I want to bring out some of the mid-range, maybe 700 Hertz, just a bit of woody texture, and some air, 16K. I want lots of airiness here. I can listen to the difference by using the F1 for bypass. I think I'm happy with that sound. I can go through the rest of the channels now and apply dynamics and EQ to each channel. But remember, I'm only processing the buses. If I wanted to mix further with individual channels, I might need to do that with a mouse in Pro Tools. But remember, we've got DAW Control over here as well. So if I press the little DAW button on the side, I switch over to DAW mode, and now I have a DAW controller over Pro Tools. On my mix window, I then have direct hands-on control over the faders. And if we have any automation present in Pro Tools, it will also move the faders on the console. So as we jump to a section that has some of that automation, we should see some action happening with some faders moving around. There's not much that you have control over. It's mostly the faders themselves controlling Pro Tools, although we can also control auxiliary sends, pans, we can scroll through banks of faders, we can enable different automation modes, and these faders are touch sensitive, so for writing touch automation that's very useful. And we can do some basic plugin controls. I'll let you explore those settings in the manual as to how to actually access them. And that's it from me. As always, the best way to learn is to spend some time practicing. Book out some time in the studio, come and do some recording here. Even if it's something simple, it's best to practice that workflow of bringing signal in, sending signal out through the headphones, and making sure that you can get signal in and out of Pro Tools. Once you've got some practical experience on the console, the manual will start to make a little bit more sense, and you can use that to supplement your knowledge of the console and improve your workflow here. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you. Cheers.